themselves. Not for the first time, he wondered what had come over him that he had agreed to this. But every time the thought entered his mind, he was immediately reminded of the words Hojan Reed had spoken and, even worse, that the boy and Bran had already known about the dead beyond the wall, and so any objections he did have died in his throat. He kept his silence. Even when they passed the Antler River, walking parallel with it until they reached its source, a high mountain that Benjen had never been this close to before, and then turned westwards to head towards the Frostfangs, he kept his silence. They were a week's march north of Craster's Keep, by his best guess, and could see the fist of the first men on the horizon when he finally found himself alone keeping watch at night. They had been taking the night shifts in small groups, but, that night, he had said he would take first watch alone. He needed time with his thoughts. He was not used to spending so much time in the company of men he did not know, and a strange sort of uncomfortableness was beginning to set in. "You grow concerned," a voice said softly. He glanced to his right, surprised to see Hojan Reed stood there with his eyes fixed on the sleeping men in the clearing in front of them. Benjen cursed quietly for not even noticing that the boy had left the safety of the middle of the group and turned his gaze back to the men who lay asleep a short distance away. He kept his eyes moving around the clearing, watching for any movement in the darkness beyond their small fires or any sounds that might alert him to anyone else being present. "I am rightly concerned," he murmured. "A moon we have been in these lands now, and we have not taken the direct route to wherever it is you think we must go. I trusted your word that Bran had to be here, Hojan, because you spoke of things you could not possibly have known to be true and events you could not possibly have known about, but I grow worried that you do not know where we are going." "I am being guided," Hojan replied. "Every night I have dreams, and the dreams tell me where to go. That is why we are taking this path." Out of the corner of his eye he watched Hojan shift slightly. "The dead are near," he said eventually. "This path, it keeps us away from the worst of them. The worst of them. They'll find us soon. But if we had gone directly, we would have been dead long before now." "How?" "I dreamt of a crow's only a lie beyond the wall betraying him to something he thought was a god. I dreamt of a babe left alone in the woods to die, and of a broken wolf being smothered by death." "Craster?" he asked, turning slightly to look at Hojan properly. All pretense about watching the encampment leaving his mind as his mind processed what he had just been told. "If that is the man who is your ally in these lands." "And the god?" Hojan's head turned towards him slowly. "Had blue eyes and smelt of death." "You dreamed that Craster would betray us to the dead?" Hojan nodded, his eyes fixed on Benjen and his mouth flat. "That is the only explanation of what I dreamt. He is your only ally beyond the wall, is he not? And I dreamed of our betrayal the night you declared we would march there." He did not reply, and they settled into a strained silence. So preoccupied was Benjen that he did not even really notice as the moon passed the highest point in the sky and began to descend. It was only when the first slithers of sunlight began to filter through the trees and bathed the clearing in sunlight that he realized that he had been on guard all night. In the clearing, the soldiers began to stir, and Benjen could see Bran waking up slowly, sitting up and glancing around to find Summer and Mira Reed. He watched as a small, embarrassed smile flickered over Bran's face, and his nephew hastily ran a hand through his hair as he realized Mira was awake and watching him. Suddenly, he became aware of eyes on him and glanced away from his nephew toward Hojan, who was watching him with a peculiar expression on his face. "Some things are inevitable, even for those of us that dream," Hojan said quietly. "You cannot escape fate. You can delay it, if you are careful and lucky, but you cannot escape it." "Do you speak of the dead or of Mira and Bran?" Hojan gave him a wry smile. "Both." Then he pushed himself off the tree he had been resting against and began to make his way into the encampment. "He's a strange boy." He glanced toward Morzumba as the man headed toward him with bread and dried meats in his hands. He took the food eagerly and wolfed it down, allowing the other man to keep watch for a few minutes. "Did you sleep at all, Stark?" He shook his head and swallowed his last mouthful of bread. "No. You look like fucking shit." He didn't reply and instead scanned the encampment. A breeze washed over him, coming from the north, and he repressed a shiver. Next to him, Mors stiffened slightly and then sighed loudly and stalked off toward some of the Umber men who had begun to pack up the camp. ***. Later that day, he called for the group to make camp in another clearing. This one was surrounded by thick pine trees with a heavy layer of snow on them and, in the center, had the remains of what had once clearly been a fire built by wildlings. But he was confident they were alone. He leaned against a tree and surveyed the encampment, watching as the Umber soldiers began to set up tents for the children and one of the men got a fire going. Next to him, Mors stood silently, his eyes fixed on the roaring flames of the fire that had suddenly burst into life. The benefit of only having one eye, is my eyesight on this side is excellent, Mors remarked suddenly. So, I can see you lurking in the trees, watching and waiting, like some sort of fucking crow ready to pick out my remaining eye, Reed. You will speak more fondly of crows before the end of this day, came the soft reply. Then, Hojan appeared out of the bushes beside them, walked past them without even glancing their way and disappeared back toward the center of the encampment. That kid is fucking odd. He didn't reply but kept his eyes fixed on the back of the boy's head as it was nearly swallowed by the snow flurries coming down. He scowled darkly up at the clouds and heaved out a sigh, watching as his breath appeared in front of him. It's getting cold, Mors remarked. In the distance, he watched as Summer darted in and out of the trees chasing snowballs that Mira was throwing at him and as Bran and Hojan sat together, with their heads bent towards each other, in the middle of the group. He repressed a shiver and wrapped his cloak more tightly around him. Around the fire Umber men were preparing rabbits to go with that evening's meal. They were nearly out of vegetables and other essentials but, given Hojan's assurances that they would arrive shortly and would not need to worry about food after, Benjen had felt confident enough to allow a larger meal tonight. He could only hope it would raise the men's spirits a bit. He shivered again as several snowflakes flew into his face. Summer let out a noise that was part howl and part bark like a common dog and turned slightly toward the south. The crows that had been resting on the snow-laden branches of the trees nearby suddenly flew into the air, as one, letting out caws of fright. They flapped their wings erratically, climbing higher into the air than Benjen thought was truly necessary, and then vanished into the snowstorm. His eyes swept across the encampment, taking in the men who had half risen with their hands on their weapons. But, after several long moments, nothing appeared, and Summer returned to Mira awaiting the next snowball. He heaved out a sigh and relaxed slightly, leaning back against the trees. Hojan thinks they will find us soon, he said softly. We should increase the watches at night. For I think. When, out of the corner of his eye he saw Mors nod, he continued, I just hope it is them we encounter and not wildlings. Mors spat into the ground. Fuck the bastards. If they are fleeing south because of the dead, then they are our ally. They're not my fucking ally until the king says they are. He did not reply and instead bit his tongue as he tried not to snap out the words that he wished he could say, that Mors Umber was a contrary, finicky, old bastard who had never met with an order he would not find reason to chafe against. He knew what Mors had suffered: the death of his wife, the abduction of his daughter and then the death of his 3 sons, and he knew that, despite the man's gruff exterior and biting words, he had suffered more than many could ever expect to. That the man was still standing, even if he was aided greatly by ale, was a testament to his strength. Still, the man frustrated him. And he knew that the Umber soldiers found him just as tedious. Where Great Jon and Small Jon gained adoration and love from their men, Mors seemed to rely solely on terror, which was a tricky beast. I do not need your pity, Benjen Stark. I was not giving it. The man scoffed and began to walk away. Then, suddenly, out of the trees around them shapes shot out. Dead men tumbled into the clearing from all sides, mouths open and hands grasping outwards. Mors Umber staggered to one side under the onslaught of dead and, in the clearing, screams erupted as the soldiers found themselves surrounded by dead. His sword was in his hand before he had even taken a step forward. Even knowing it would likely do no good, he slashed and stabbed at the dead clambering over Mors Umber. He could hear the man roaring in anger and agony. He kicked a dead man out of the way and sent it stumbling into the snow. A rotting hand grasped at his shoulder and he shook it off, spinning and slashing wildly, decapitating the head off what had once been an incredibly old wildling woman. He turned again, mindful of the dead beginning to swarm the rest of the encampment, and then suddenly Mors Umber was forcing himself up from underneath the mountain of clawing hands and gasping mouths. Bastards! The man hacked and swung his sword viciously, taking limbs and heads off various wights. In the distance, Benjen could hear Summer howling, the sounds of flesh being ripped apart and, one of the Umber soldiers roaring at the others to protect Bran, Mira and Hojan. He slashed at bodies that grasped at him and kicked away another body as it clawed its way across the ground toward him. Cold began to seep into his veins, but he tried not to focus on it. Next to him, Mors Umber continued to swing his sword from side to side, hacking mindlessly at the bodies. Something grabbed onto his leg, and he glanced down and hastily shook his leg, staggering slightly, as he tried to dislodge the headless wight that was still trying to crawl up his body. Something else grasped his free hand and pain tore through him. He turned towards the pain and swore as his eyes lit on a wight with its teeth embedded in his hand. A flash of fire appeared out of the side of his eye and, suddenly, flames clawed up the wight that had sunk its teeth into him. It let out a terrible shriek of pain and then vanished under a torrent of flames. "Protect Bran Stark!" someone roared. He didn't acknowledge whoever had roared the command and instead kept fighting, slashing and hacking at any wights that came near him. More rotted hands grasped at him, but whoever had the fire was there burning the wights as quickly as they could. Finally, through a brief gap in the rotting corpses, he caught a glimpse of Meera Reed and one of the Umber soldiers stood only a short distance away, both carrying flaming branches and setting every wight they could on fire. Nearby, Mors let out another furious roar and something grasped at Benjen again. His first instinct was to push whatever it was away, but he realized this hand was warm and so he let Mors drag him toward Meera. "Fall back!" He yelled once he was near to Meera and could chance taking his eyes off the wights around him to look at the fire where his nephew had been. He could not see Bran, nor Hojan Reed, through the rows of Umber soldiers that had formed a tight circle presumably around his nephew. Meera nodded and together the group began to fight through the dead toward the larger group. Sweat dripped into his eyes, and he could see that the others with him were just as affected, yet he could feel himself getting colder and colder. Something grabbed at his face and he skidded backwards, nearly toppling over a rock hidden under the snow, as he tried to avoid the clawing hand of a dead child. It was scarcely Bran's age, with a rotted face and barely any clothes left on its body. Clearly what clothes it had once been worn had been lost to the weather over the years, and yet, despite how dead it looked, Benjen could not stop himself from breathing out, fuck, and making to lower his sword almost without realizing it. It was only when a sword swung out from beside him and cut cleanly through the child's torso, severing it into two bits, and the upper part of the torso continued to pull itself across the frozen ground toward him, than he managed to move again. He brought his leg up and then shoved his foot forcefully into the dead child's spine. It kept moving, but more slowly than before, and he turned away. A knife appeared out of the corner of his eye, and he pushed a wight away from him and then jabbed at another as he tried to back towards where the fire had been burning in the middle of the camp. The ground became littered with bodies and small fires sprung up around them as Meera kept lighting more of the wights on fire, and yet the dead kept coming. More and more of them raced out of the forest around them and joined the fight. His group kept fighting to get back to where Bran was. Every opportunity he had, he chanced to glance toward the Umber soldiers, and every time he did, he saw fewer and fewer men there. The snow began to fall more heavily until he could barely see more than a few feet ahead of him. But, eventually, his group managed to fight its way toward Bran. The Umber soldiers there roared their approval and opened their ranks long enough to allow Benjen to shove Meera into the safety of the group. He grasped a branch half stuck in the fire that still roared next to Bran the buck they had been cooking, now charred beyond recognition, and spun around, immediately setting two wights on fire. His teeth began to chatter slightly, as a wind picked up and the snow flurries began to drift sideways into his face and eyes, making it almost impossible for him to see the wights until they were inches from his face. His cheeks felt strangely rigid, as though even if had wanted to smile he would not have been able to. In front of his face he could see puffs of warm air that vanished almost instantly in the cold every time he exhaled. More wights began to appear out of the darkness around them, but they kept fighting. He could not say for sure how long they had been fighting, but, eventually, his arms began to tire and the mound of bodies in front of the circle around Bran seemed to be growing ever higher. Even with all the men setting every wight that came near them on fire, almost creating a ring of fire around them, the wights kept coming, clambering over the dead who were slowly burning, or who were trapped under burning dead, as though they were not even there. The smell of charred flesh and burning was beginning to claw its way down his throat, making it harder for him to breathe, and he could hear someone retching nearby. He could hear some snarling and the sound of flesh being ripped apart, and an Umber man roaring instructions to other soldiers to protect Bran at all costs. Then, suddenly, the whites stopped clawing their way over their dead and there was nothing directly in front of Benjen other than dead or burning whites. Other than the choked gasps of Umbermen as they sucked in lungs full of air, the crackling of the various fires now burning around them, and his own blood pumping through him, Benjen could not hear anything. If it had not been for the fact he could see the whites, just on the other side of the mound of bodies, he would have thought they had vanished back into the darkness of the forest. Next to him, Mors took half a step forward. He watched the man carefully and kept his own sword raised. Like the perimeter, Mors breathed. "Something is coming." When no one moved, the man said more loudly, "Like the fucking perimeter." Around Benjen, the Umber soldiers still standing burst into life, all lunging forwards and swiping the burning branches they held across the mound of whites, relighting the flames that had been slowly burning down. Fire erupted in front of him, arching high into the sky. Yet, even as it burned and the flames rose higher and higher, cold began to settle over Benjen. He shivered and flexed his fingers around the pommel of his sword as they began to grow numb, knowing that if he did not that he might lose his grip on his sword altogether. Around him he could hear the men muttering about the cold not being natural. There. He glanced behind him, toward Bran, and then away again as his gaze followed the direction in which Bran was pointing. Striding out of the early evening darkness and thick snowfall, was something that immediately made him take a step back, like he was one of the many cowardly brothers who had fled the Watch over the years. It was tall, far taller than he was, with pale flesh that almost seemed to blend into the snowfall around it, making it impossible to tell just how tall or how big it truly was, with what appeared to be wispy white hair. The only thing that Benjen could be sure about was the color of its eyes, a brilliant bright blue like the color of the milk water when it froze if the temperatures dropped too much. It left no footsteps on the ground as it crossed over the snow, and Benjen could not hear it make a noise either, not the crunching of snow under its feet and not the chinking of the armor he could see. If he had not been looking straight at it, he would not have known it was there. The name of the creature came to him unbidden, Other. He shivered as the creature's eyes lit on him as it looked over all the men gathered behind the line of fire in turn. His mind flashed to his brothers, the men he had found moons ago, dead and yet not dead, and he wondered if they had experienced this same terror before they had died, or if they had been given the mercy of a quick death. The other said something in a high-pitched voice that sounded like the ice on a lake cracking, and suddenly all the dead began to move again. They walked slowly now, as though whatever the other had said had given them purpose, and crossed over toward the flames. As one they stopped in front of the fire, and then, in an instant, the first row of dead threw themselves down onto it. "Keep the fire going," he roared, realizing what they were trying to do. It was in vain though. No matter how many times he or the Umbermen lunged forward to try and reignite the flames went out moments later until, eventually, they were fighting again. He lost many of the men in the chaos that followed. All he knew was what he was doing, fighting. He hacked at white after white and watched as more and more of the Umbermen fell under the onslaught. Eventually, when he could, he chanced to glance around him to see what had happened to the children and to Mors. He found them both in an instant. He watched as Mors' Umber struggled whilst the White Walker pressed him further into the snow-covered ground. The White Walker was playing with the man, Benjen could tell. He turned away, having seen enough. He fought harder, striking down white after white to try and get to the other man. But for every white he killed, another two seemed to appear. Bony hands grabbed at him and tried to tug him backwards into the snowy ground. He gritted his teeth and fought them off, stabbing and slashing blindly, unable to really see what he was doing. In the distance he could hear Bran crying and Summer letting out howls of rage. No matter how hard he fought, more appeared. Something grabbed him around the legs, and he glanced down to see a dead woman locking her arms around him and restricting his movement. He tumbled forward, losing his grip on his sword, and fell face first into the snow. Bony hands ripped at his clothing and his arms and legs, and he let out a roar of agony as their sharp nails cut deep grooves into his skin. Dark splotches flashed against his eyes, and he struggled to see anything, and he swallowed mouthful after mouthful of snow as he screamed in agony. Then, suddenly, everything stopped and something or someone's were forcing him further into the snow. He flailed and struggled to push the dead weight off him, finally finding traction to heave himself to his knees. He flung his arms out blindly as he coughed up mouthfuls of snow and tried to find his sword. Everything was silent. Eventually, his hand grasped the pommel of his sword, and he staggered to his feet swinging his sword around as though to fight off any dead who might think of attacking him. It was only when he was fully upright, and his vision had begun to clear, that he realized what had happened. Around him, the dead had collapsed. Only the living remained in the clearing. He glanced around, eyes skimming over the dozen umbermen that remained, all of whom appeared to be injured in some way until, finally, his eyes alit on Moore's umber laying flat on his back and, behind him, the 3 children and Summer. He strode over, staggering slightly as exhaustion began to overtake him, toward the children. As soon as he was close enough, he scooped Bran into his arms and held him close, breathing in the smell of dirt, sweat, and blood. Yet, underneath that, he could still smell Bran. "Are you hurt?" Bran shook his head against his shoulder and clasped him tightly for a moment before he pushed Benjen away, as though he had remembered he was in front of other people and did not wish to look like a little boy. He let Bran wiggle free and then checked over Mira and Hojan. Once he was happy, they were unharmed, he turned back towards Moors. He loomed over the man who was covered in what appeared to be thousands of tiny ice shards. "What happened?" "Stabbed the fucker. Bastard exploded all over me," Moors huffed out, still laying on his back with his arm up in the air. The chunk of dragon glass that had once been used to cover up his empty eye socket was grasped so tightly in his hand that blood was beginning to drip down his hand and onto the snow near him. Slowly, as though realizing the threat was past, he lowered his arm until he was splayed completely on his back with his arms either side of him. A few moments later, Moors twisted his head slightly so he could gaze at Benjen with his one eye and said, "Guess the kid was right. Crows ain't half bad." 300 AC Jon Snow. It had only taken a day after Aemon's arrival for him to find himself gathering the newly appointed small council. It had not taken him long, once he had begun to think through the options, to decide who to appoint to which position. Although, for all he knew, they may not wish to remain his small council for long given the news he was about to tell them, for they may begin to think him as mad as his grandfather had been. From his position at the head of the table he watched as Oberyn Martell, as his newly appointed Master of Coin, and Adamar Brand, his newly appointed Master of Laws, had a hushed conversation that seemed to edge slightly closer to an argument given the way Oberyn's hand had drifted to his dagger than Jon was comfortable with. Still, they had not yet drawn blades, and he knew that, for all Oberyn's sharp words and explosive temper, the man would not spill blood today. Maester Cresson sat on the other side of the 2 men, his eyes fixed on the ceiling and a genial smile on his face. His appointment was only temporary until the Citadel found a new Maester to send to King's Landing, but there was a small part of Jon that wished he could keep the man. He offered good counsel, he was polite to everyone regardless of their age or standing and, from all Daenerys had said, he was a good man. But then, Jon supposed, he was bound to find any Maester good after spending 10 minutes in Pycelle's company before they had decided he was best served by returning to the Citadel given his age. Stannis was on his right-hand side, as he should be as hand, with Varys next to him. He had wondered about whether it was wise to keep Varys, given all that had happened, but ultimately, he had decided that the man had come to him and had provided good counsel, and he would listen. And, as Aemon had pointed out, better to keep those he was unsure about close. Then, on Varys' other side, sat Montford Valerian, who would be taking the position as Master of Ships. Jon had considered giving the role to one of the Mandaely men but had decided, in the end, that when the day came that Stannis was no longer willing to be his hand, he would likely wish to name a Northerner to the position, and there were few better suited than a Mandaely. He knew that his small council had been subject to lots of mutterings and mumblings. Many thought he should have installed a man from the Reach, or even the Vale, rather than Adamar Brand. But, Sir Adam had proven himself in the battle, and with such instability in the Vale, after the death of Petyr Baelish and the refusal of Lysa Arryn to bend the knee, Jon had not thought it wise to ask Lord Royce to serve on his small council when the man was busy trying to convince others to help him remove Robin Arryn from his mother's clutches. Olenna Tyrell was due to arrive in King's Landing within the moon, and he was sure that she would likewise have views about his small council. But he had already agreed with Robb that their children would wed, which, as he was sure Lady Olenna would know, was the quickest way to put Tyrell blood on the throne. And, more importantly, he had asked Garland Tyrell to remain in King's Landing with his wife when she arrived with Lady Olenna for the foreseeable future, not only to help with the formation of a Kingsguard but also to help get the City Watch into shape. He had not broached what would happen after yet with Garland, for the man was so busy with the King's Guard they had yet to spend more than a few minutes at a time in each other's company, but he hoped that given the man's fondness for Viserys, and their own growing friendship, that the man would be willing to stay as an advisor and a formal member of his small council. Certainly, he did not expect the man leaving King's Landing within the next few years given the amount of work to be done. Between Garland remaining in King's Landing and the agreed betrothal with Robb, he did not think there was much that Olenna Tyrell could complain about, although he was sure, based on what he had heard of the woman, that she would find something to quibble over. He glanced away from his perusal of Sir Adam toward the door as it creaked open and smiled as Daenerys led Aemon into the room, and then, immediately, he frowned. Aemon looked even frailer than he had the night before. It was almost as though he was failing in front of Jon's eyes. He watched carefully as Daenerys helped Aemon to walk to the seat closest to the door and then settled him down. She glanced toward Jon briefly and he smiled, and she hastily sat in the other empty seat. He looked away quickly, trying to avoid meeting Aemon's eyes as his uncle gazed at him. He cleared his throat and tried not to twist his fingers together under the table and instead rested his sweaty palms on his legs and gazed around the men present. "Thank you for coming so quickly. I know it is not yet long past daybreak, but this is urgent and cannot wait. Last night my uncle Aemon, who is the Maester at Castle Black, informed me that the dead have been seen walking beyond the wall. Not only that, there are rumors of wildlings moving south in greater numbers than we have ever seen before." "Dead?" "Aye, Sir Adam." "Dead?" Sir Adam's eyes whipped from Jon to Aemon and back again. "Do you have proof, Maester?" Aemon shook his head, a small smile on his face. "I do not. How could I have? It is not as though we can capture one and bring one south. They cannot be reasoned with. They cannot be stopped. They cannot be contained. They cannot be controlled. The only thing that stops them, that we know of, is fire, and even that is not foolproof. Benjen Stark, who has been First Ranger at Castle Black for over 10 years now, encountered some on a mission to find missing brothers. Even when he cut the head off one, it still tried to kill him. It had been our brother, our sworn brother, and he had to burn the body before it would stop attacking him, and even as it burned it still tried to strangle him. So, no one but Benjen Stark has seen the dead." "No," Prince Oberyn Aemon replied. "But I trust Benjen Stark. And if he says that his brothers tried to kill him, and that even when he took the head off one the man still tried to gouge out his eyes, then I trust him." There was a moment of silence, and then Maester Cresson leaned forward and peered at Aemon down the length of the table. "And the wildlings?" "Move south," Aemon replied. "In the larger numbers than we have seen before. 100 dead at the hands of House Umber in a moon alone. We can go years without seeing such numbers. How in 7 hells are they getting past the wall?" "They are climbing it." "By the gods," Sir Adam breathed. "But it's over 700 feet. "Exactly," he said, speaking before his uncle could. "And what could make a man climb such a thing if not out of fear?" "Forgive me for stating the obvious, but winter is coming," Maester Cresson murmured. "Perhaps they are just fleeing south for it. It has been a long summer and a long winter is almost certain." "They survived the winter between 231 and 235 without coming south in such numbers," Aemon replied quietly. "I would know. I was there." An uneasy silence settled over the room. Jon leaned back slightly in his chair and wiped his sweaty hands down his legs as he surveyed the expressions of the men at his small council, Daenerys and Aemon. Only Daenerys met his eyes, and she gave him a small smile and then glanced away. "I met some wildlings when I left Castle Black nearly 2 years ago," he said, breaking the silence. "They were fleeing south. The last one, before I killed him, begged me to burn his body. His last words, and he begged to be burned." He sighed and leaned forward, moving his hands off his legs and clasping them on the top of the table. "Even if my uncle Benjen is mistaken, and the dead are not walking beyond the wall, if the wildlings are moving south then we need to respond." Prince Oberyn shot him a long look over the rim of his mug of wine. "Surely you do not need us all here for this. Why should the protection of the North and defense of it fall to just the North? If those in Slavers Bay were to invade Dorne tomorrow, would we leave the Dornish to defend themselves alone? If the Ironborn were to attack the Arbor tomorrow, would we leave Lord Redwyne to defend himself alone? I would hope not. But if winter is coming, then we must harvest and prepare, as Maester Cresson says. A long summer almost always means a long winter. We have been at war for nearly 2 years. We are already behind. He nodded in agreement. We shall make arrangements, but I want to be clear that every kingdom is expected to send aid to the war. And what of ruling the 7 kingdoms? You are the king. Your place belongs with your army, but you have only just taken the throne, Sir Adam said quietly. Lord Baratheon and I have already discussed this matter. He will stay here along with Lord Varys, he replied. And Princess Daenerys, Prince Viserys? Oberyn asked, leaning forward and placing his elbows on the table as he propped his chin on his hands. I do not wish to be the one to say it, but you are marching to war and your heir is unconscious, and unlikely to wake. You risk instability, or worse, if you fall. ***. Why do the Dothraki follow Shireen? Daenerys glanced up at him and frowned. They were in his solar in the armchairs closest to the fire. On the table between them the cold meats and fruit he had asked to be brought up from the kitchen sat untouched, but the large flagon of watered wine was half empty. He reached forward and poured them both some more and took a deep swig of his own drink as he waited for her to reply. Daenerys did not drink and instead continued to watch him. Her legs were tucked up under her and her skirts were pulled up as well. He glanced away, trying not to stare too much, and instead fixed on the crib at the side of her chair where Rhaego slept fitfully. One of Daenerys' hands was dangled into it, and from his position, Jon could see that even in his sleep Rhaego was clutching Daenerys' fingers tightly. On the larger armchair on the other side of the crib sat Aemon, who had his head tilted back and eyes closed as he snored slightly. Jon smiled softly at the sight and then, finally, turned back to Daenerys, who was still regarding him with a strange expression on her face. Eventually, she sighed. Because of her grayscale. They are scared of her. Daenerys shook her head slowly and pursed her lips. Grayscale is known as a Valyrian curse. The Dothraki know it well. Near Slaver's Bay there are whole areas where the Dothraki will not go because it is where those infected with grayscale are sent to die. I do not understand, he admitted. He could feel his lips twisting and brow furrowing as he tried to understand what Daenerys was saying. Daenerys gave him a soft look and sighed. That she has lived for so long, with no change in her affliction, makes her strong in their eyes. And the Dothraki follow strength, he murmured. Truly. Does she know? No, and we shall not tell her, Daenerys replied sharply. She is still so unsure of her grayscale. I am not sure that her knowing would be of benefit to her. It may make her uncomfortable. He hummed and inclined his head before he leaned forward and put his empty mug back on the table. Aemon told me that she has been sitting with Viserys. She reads to him. Yes, Daenerys murmured. She was silent for a moment and then she shifted slightly and exposed slightly more of her pale legs. She asked me if she could. It does him and Aerion good, I think. You still think there is something there? She does have Targaryen blood, a soft voice said, making Jon flinch slightly as he realized that he had been staring unblinkingly at Daenerys and had forgotten that they were not alone. He glanced toward Aemon, who rubbed at his eyes before he fixed Jon with a look that Jon knew all too well. You cannot be surprised if the dragons have taken to her. Dragoseeds with less Targaryen blood in than Lady Shireen claimed dragons during the dance. You still think she will take a dragon, he said, trying his best not to look at Daenerys even though he could tell she had leaned forward to look at Aemon. By all accounts, she has dragon dreams, Aemon replied. The dreams happened around when my children were born. He glanced away from Aemon to Daenerys again. You agree? You think she has dragon dreams? I think we should not discount the possibility, Daenerys murmured. And my children have taken to her. They would have let her mount them at Dragonstone if she had tried, if only to save Rhaego. I cannot think of another they would have so easily bent their wing to. She is stronger than she appears, Aemon said quietly. There was a brief pause as his uncle shifted against his chair and leaned back against it, almost sinking into the fabric. She has had to be in order to survive as long as she has. With such scars many would not have survived, nor thrived, as she has done. They would have given up. It is a woman's strength she possesses. The same as my mother. They fell silent for a moment, and Jon did his best not to catch Daenerys' eyes and instead stared at the egg in the fireplace as it rocked backwards and forwards slightly. You will put the egg on the pyre with me, Aemon said suddenly softly. There was a brief pause and then he glanced away from the egg and toward Jon. The dragon will be hers, one day. Once she is wed. Shireen. His uncle nodded, his face suddenly looking older than it had done moments before. She will be the first since the dance. The first whose mother and father are not Targaryens. Her great-grandmother Aemon murmured. You know what this means. It will change everything, Jon. She must marry Viserys before she claims the dragon. There is no other choice. And the children, Daenerys whispered. Her voice caught slightly, and she cleared her throat and pressed on, and the children will have to marry mine or Jon's. Yes. Or you risk a rebellion years in the making. But you're not dying. Just today you came with me to the dragon pit. Men about to die cannot travel. I am old, Daenerys Aemon heaved out. He shifted slightly against his chair and leaned forward to look at her. Jon watched as his uncle gave Daenerys a soft smile. I am 102 name days. I have lived through the reign of 6 Targaryen kings, and a Baratheon one. I have seen summers and winters and watched tens of thousands of sunrises. I watched House Targaryen fall and I got the chance to help it rise. I have done everything I have ever wanted to. There is nothing left for me, not now. Not now you are all safe. I'm not ready for you to go, Daenerys whispered. I've only just found you. It's not fair. Life is never fair, Aemon whispered. He leaned forward further and offered his hand out toward her. Jon watched as Daenerys' hand shot out to grasp it instantly, her fingers tightening around his hand as though she would never let him go. You of all people know this. And you of all people know that only death can pay for life. He leaned back in his chair, as understanding washed through him. His eyes flicked from Aemon toward Daenerys, who was paler than he had ever seen her. She half rose to her feet even as Jon watched and tried to whip her hand away from Aemon's, but Jon knew it would not work. Aemon was stronger than he looked. He always had been. He would not want you to do this, Daenerys hissed. But her voice cracked as tears began to pool at the corner of her eyes, and so the words she had tried to get out in anger came out as a rasp instead. She collapsed into her chair. I do not want you to do this. Jon glanced away, turning his attention back to the egg in the flames, to give them a moment together. Something brushed against his conscience and then it vanished again. Yes, you do, Aemon said eventually, his voice soft. You need not lie to me. He is your brother. If our roles were reversed, and it was Egg who lay dying and my grandfather or my great-uncle who offered his life in exchange for my brother's, I would hate the idea, but I would also wish for it. And that is nothing to be ashamed of. Even without looking toward his uncle, Jon could tell he was smiling sadly. The tone of his voice was one he only ever used when he was talking about something that made him inexplicably happy and sad in equal measure. I do not want to die. No man wishes to die. But death is coming for me, Daenerys. I can feel its breath against my neck even now, and when I close my eyes I can feel its touch on my shoulder. I would have my death mean something. Aemon was silent for so long that Jon turned to look at him, and he was surprised to see his uncle's eyes were wet and tears were trickling down his face. I failed you and Viserys 5 and 10 years ago when I did not come to your aid. You suffered due to my neglect. And whilst I am glad that, eventually, I was able to remedy that mistake, it is not enough. You deserve a life with each other, and with Jon, and to be a family as you always should have been. Let me give you that. Let me give you the family I should have given you all those years ago. Interlude, 300 AC Aemon Targaryen. The Red Queen, he said softly, his hand coming up and resting on the edge of Melee's skull. My old friend. You know them. He glanced up, peering around the darkness for a few moments before his eyes finally alit on a small figure some distance away. He had missed her at first. It was made hard to find her in the dark, even though she carried a torch of her own, given the torches in brackets on the walls were casting shadows around the room and the little girl was hidden half concealed behind another skull. Between her skulking behind a huge skull Dremfyr, he thought, and the twisting of shadows, it was a wonder his old eyes could find her at all. I know them all, he confirmed. They were my friends growing up. The small figure took a step closer, and then another. Within a few more steps her face was thrown into sharp relief, and he instantly knew he must be talking to. The grayscale on her face was as shocking as everyone said, but it was her eyes that drew his attention, true Baratheon eyes. He had not seen their like in nearly 90 years, not since he had last been in King's Landing. "Your Maester Eamon," the young girl breathed. "Joe the king told me about you." "And you are Lady Shireen Baratheon," he replied. "Does your father know you are here?" Shireen flushed red under the torchlight and looked at her feet for a moment. "I'm hiding. From him. From everyone." "Ah. I am as well. Shall we hide together?" Shireen nodded and made her way over to him. Trusting. Too trusting. They stood there for a moment, staring at each other, before he gestured to the ledge nearby. The ledge had once held smaller skulls, but all that remained now was dust. Someone had clearly taken great delight in smashing the skulls of the smaller dragons. He brushed his hand over the ledge and set the dust tumbling into the air. The light from the torch in the bracket above caught on it as it fluttered to the ground, and he glimpsed a few black specks in the dust. "Teeth. It's horrible up there," Shireen whispered eventually. "Everyone whispers about how Prince Viserys will not wake up. Robb Stark will not leave his chambers. The King and Princess Daenerys are always sad. The Northerners are mourning the loss of Ned Stark, and Lady Mormont and Lord Umber." There was a sharp intake of breath. "I do not mean to sound so horrible. You do not," he assured her. "To grieve alone is horrible, and so people share their grief. And to grieve, it is to feel pain. There has been enough of that for a lifetime in this place. I do not blame you for hiding. Sir Onion Knight Sir Davos says I should not hide, but he does not tell father." "And where does your father think you are?" "With Maester Cresson, learning my letters." "And where does Maester Cresson think you are?" "He knows where I am." "Ah. He is your friend." Shireen nodded, and her hair flew away from her scarred cheek for a moment, and the flames above them made it appear even more twisted and awful than it had first looked. Her hand whipped up instinctively, and she made to push her hair forwards again before she paused and carefully lowered her hand, leaving her scarred cheek exposed. "It's nice down here," Shireen said suddenly. "People think I'm weird, for liking it. But it's peaceful. And the skulls of the dragon feel like home." Her eyes shot up towards him and she nodded quickly. "Like home. I feel like I belong." "That is because you do," he assured her. "Your great-grandmother was a Targaryen." "That was a long time ago. I'm not really a Targaryen." "No, you're a Baratheon. But House Baratheon was founded by a Targaryen bastard, and you have more Targaryen blood in you than many others alive today. It is natural that you would feel drawn here." Shireen was silent for a moment, and then she shifted slightly and dropped the torch she had been holding onto the floor. Together they watched as the flames spluttered and died, leaving only the torches in the brackets on the walls to light the chamber. "Why are you hiding down here?" He didn't reply for a moment and instead pondered the question. In truth, he wasn't entirely sure why he was down in the cellars. There was nothing here but death and ghosts. The ghosts of dragons, the ghosts of his childhood, the ghost of his brothers darting in between the skulls. He had come down here to be alone, and then, when he had been alone, he had never felt more like an old man. He glanced away from Shireen and then toward the skulls again. "I wanted to see them one last time," he said eventually, not disputing the fact he was hiding. When Shireen shifted next to him, he gave her a soft smile. "Would you like me to tell you of them? I imagine it will not take long at all for you to name them, friend, as I do. And it would be nice to know that when I am gone there will be someone with Targaryen blood in their veins who remembers them and knows them as I do." Chapter 38, Reborn. Chapter Text. Chapter Summary. We say hello and goodbye. Notes. Next up, the foundations laid in the last two chapters start to bear fruit. The Three-Eyed Raven, Jon Goes North. 300 AC. Robb Stark. "I miss Father," Jon said suddenly, breaking the companionable silence that settled over them. "Same," murmured Theon. They were on the balcony of Robb's chambers, staring across the Blackwater Rush. It had become their nightly routine to gather on the balcony, share a drink, and enjoy each other's company. They knew it would not last forever, for Robb would be returning to the north shortly. Not that he had told his brothers just how soon he planned to leave, and Theon would be heading to White Harbor, rather than back to Winterfell, and Jon would remain in King's Landing. They would see each other in future battles, weddings and funerals, but it would not be the same. He sighed and ran a hand down his face, suddenly feeling inexplicably tired and worn, as though he had just finished fighting a great battle only minutes before, instead of nearly 2 weeks before. At the small table that was set on the balcony, Theon glanced away from the scroll in his hands and toward Rob. Their eyes met for a moment, and Theon quirked his lips in a soft smile before he turned back to scroll. His fingers tapped erratically against the table, and Rob could not help but watch the other man's movements. "I was going to ask for him to wed Winifred and I in the Godswood at Winterfell," Theon muttered. "Winifred and I discussed it, 2 weddings. One in the sight of the old gods and one under the faith of the 7. You can still wed in the Godswood," he replied, despite knowing that it was not what Theon was truly lamenting but not quite knowing how to broach the issue. Theon smiled at him sadly and then nodded. "It just feels strange. He shall never know the path he set me on and how grateful I am, or the sort of man I hope to become." "Have become," Jon corrected softly, his voice sharp. "You're a good man, Theon. Father knew that." Theon nodded, as though to himself, and then sighed. "Have you heard from Sansa?" "I did," Jon murmured. There was a brief pause, during which Rob turned his attention from Theon to Jon and watched as his brother flushed under the weight of his gaze. "Rather, I received word from Lord Willers. He said that Sansa has sought comfort in Gendry and that Rickon and Arya continue to cause chaos wherever they go." "And Bran?" Rob watched as Jon's eyes flicked slightly away for them for a moment, a sure sign Jon was about to lie. "He is also well." He opened his mouth to call his brother out on the lie, but before he could, Theon had muttered, "You're a shit liar, Snow." "King Snow, to you," came the quick reply. The 3 of them shared another smile, and Rob couldn't help but feel a pang of gratitude that, despite all that had happened and had changed these last years, his brother was still his brother, just softened slightly and no longer looking to find slight or insult in every exchange. He had feared, all those moons ago, that once Jon had met his Targaryen relatives he would change, perhaps become harsher and less able to joke with him and Theon. Yet, if anything, it seemed the arrival of Daenerys and Viserys had softened his brother. "What is wrong with Bran?" Jon glanced between him and Theon and chewed on his lip for a moment. "He's not at Winterfell." "Where is he?" "Beyond the wall." There was a sound like glass breaking and Rob swung around toward where Theon was, watching as the other man nursed a bloody hand, shards of glass embedded in his fingers and palm of his hand. "Shit," mumbled Theon. "Fucking shit." He ignored Theon as the other man began pulling the shards of glass out and turned toward Jon. "That is not a funny joke, brother." "It wasn't a joke. Bran went beyond the wall moons ago." "Whatever the fuck for?" gasped out Theon. There was a brief pause, then a strangled groan and a muttered, "Fuck." Then Theon said more strongly, "Why the fuck would Bran do that? He can't fucking walk." "And how do you know when I did not?" "Because I was the one who allowed him to go north," Jon replied. ****. Nearly an hour later, Rob stared at his brother as Jon finally finished speaking. "You did not say?" "I did not know until a few days ago," Jon replied sharply. "Not until Aemon confirmed they had gone beyond the wall." "What was I to do? Alarm you in the midst of a war for something I did not know for certain had happened? And yet you knew it might happen." He snapped. "Have you thought of Bran at all this last year? You sent our brother to his death." "I had no choice," Jon roared, his voice echoing around them as he pushed himself away from the wall. His brother closed his eyes and sucked in a deep breath. "You know as well as I do, if someone has green dreams, whatever they dream of will happen. Hojan dreams that father had summoned his banners. He dreamed of direwolves in the dragon pit and more dragons than winter in King's Landing before Dany's dragons were even born. He dreamed of a kraken and a merman intertwined. He has dreamed of so much and all of it has come true to my knowledge. No matter what I did, Bran was destined to go north." "Merman. Theon," he muttered. "Now is not the time." Theon, a merman and a kraken. He dreamed it before you had ever met Winifred." "It proves nothing," he snarled. "This proves nothing. He is our brother, and you sent him to his death." "I sent him north with as many men as I could." "He has dozens of Umber men with him," Jon replied. "Why do you think I told Gratian to send his son back to Last Hearth and to retain so many men? We needed those men in my army. But I kept them in the north for Bran. I weakened my army for Bran. All I did for Bran. He sucked in a breath, desperately trying to push down the anger that was clawing its way up his throat. He knew why Jon had not told him before even without asking, and yet the betrayal still stung. And it was that which made him angry, not that Jon had sent Bran north, because, for all that Robb was furious with Jon, he knew that his brother would not have gambled with Bran's life, and that Jon was right. Green dreams would come true. One way or another he had done all he could to protect Bran, but the dishonesty, the lack of trust. Eventually, once he had managed to force his anger down and he felt capable of speaking to his brother without screaming in anger, he said, "And the dead? Did you know of them?" "No. Not then. We need to bring him home." We do," Jon replied. "Which is why when my armies march north, we are not stopping at Castle Black." "You mean to march beyond the wall?" "Aye." ***. 2 days later, Robb and Jon walked through the cellars of the Red Keep. Their guards stood at one of the entrances, and so, other than the dragon skulls, they were completely alone. "How long?" Jon glanced away from him towards the largest skull in the far corner of the room. It loomed over the others, casting flickering shadows onto them, and Robb couldn't help but take a step back as his mind suddenly completely understood why the Seven Kingdoms had knelt to Aegon and his sisters. There had always been a part of him that had wondered why so many had knelt so fast, even after he had met Winter, yet the skull of Balerion was evidence enough of why any man would kneel. "It'll be soon. Today, perhaps tomorrow." "I'm sorry." Jon quirked a soft smile at him. "No man can live forever, and Aemon has lived longer than most." "You need not tell me that," he remarked. "The stories he has told me of Lord Commanders at the Night's Watch and the Starks of Winterfell he has met, well, let us just say that he seems to have met every Stark father ever mentioned to me. And then some." A pang of grief flashed across Jon's face, and for a moment Robb wondered if he had upset his brother. But then it vanished, and Jon smiled at him, and Robb realized it was grief that Aemon had wasted years at the wall, not over his impending death, and guilt that Jon had been saved from it. Jon turned away from him slightly and stared at the skull of Balerion nearby. He tried not to look at it because, although all the skulls made him slightly uncomfortable in a way he imagined anyone who was not a Targaryen would be, there was something about Balerion's skull in particular that set him on edge. The dragon's teeth were longer than Icewar's, and his eye sockets were so large that Robb thought he could probably curl up inside one and go to sleep if he so wished. It made Robb uncomfortable in a way he had never been before, and it was equal parts terror and anticipation. Terror that, one day, Winter would be that size, and anticipation because if they were truly to fight the dead, then that day could not come soon enough. Aemon brought an egg with him from the wall. "Another. Grey and gold," Jon murmured. "He wishes for us to put it on his pyre." There was something in Jon's voice that made Robb stop walking, and as soon as he turned to look upon Jon's face, he knew what it was: fear. "You think it will hatch?" "Aemon does. You all have dragons already," he pointed out. "Viserys has Aerion, Daenerys has Balerion, and I know that Rhaego has Jaerion." When Jon began walking again, he followed and continued speaking. "From all you have said that Aemon taught you, and all that Daenerys has said these last weeks, none of your dragons have hatched for no cause." He was silent for a moment, his mind working through the possibilities. "Lady Shireen. Daenerys believes she has dragon dreams. That is why, despite your reservations, you named Viserys your heir again despite his condition," he breathed, his eyes closing for half a second. "If he weds Shireen, then if she does claim the dragon, his claim is still stronger. Together they would be hard to topple. If we could count on your support." "Always," he said firmly. "And you shall have the Reaches as well because of Margaery." Jon nodded. "That is what I hoped. Between the Crown Lands, Stormlands, Reach and the North, it would enough for Viserys and Shireen should I fall. Uncle Edmure would support them as well." Jon tossed a wry smile his way. "Even with the stories of what Viserys was like before he landed in Westeros?" "Aye," he replied. "We all know, Jon. Viserys did not shy away from it, and the Dothraki's grasp on the common tongue is quite improved from what Maester Cresson says it was. Do you think I've made a mistake in choosing Viserys over Daenerys?" Jon nodded. They kept walking for a few moments as Robb pondered how best to reply. I cannot say, he said eventually as they began to move closer toward the smaller skulls Sunfi and Moondancer, if Rob remembered what Lady Shireen had said to him correctly. He glanced at one nearby, taking in the jagged shards around an eye socket, and flinched away, imagining just how painful that dragon's death must have been. Viserys wishes to be a good man, he began again, when he realized he had failed to give Jon what he needed. I believe he thinks he has too much of Varys in him though. You disagree? I think Viserys has done terrible things, he murmured as they drew to a stop by the smallest skull that remained. His eyes roved over it for a moment, taking in how much smaller it was compared to even Daenerys' 3 dragons. I also think he regrets them all. As I said, I think he wishes to be a good man. And with the right counsel and the right allies, and perhaps, in time, the right wife, he will be a good man. He will never be as honorable or as kind as father, but he is not another Maegor. He sucked in a deep breath and said, and no matter how fond you are of Daenerys, you know that the lords of Westeros will never support her, not when she has a son of her own, and he would be next in line after her. Any man that married her, he would just be for show. Or she would risk another dance. No. Viserys was your only choice. Whether it was a good choice I cannot say. But I hope it is. Jon's shoulders slumped slightly as though a great weight had been lifted off them. You have always spoken the truth to me, brother. I shall miss you when you leave. We still have time, he replied. I shall not go before Lady Olenna arrives. Margaery wishes to see her grandmother and I offered to provide an escort. How is Margaery? Jon asked, leaning against the wall behind him. He gave his brother a wry smile. Concerned but trying to pretend she is not. He paused and glanced toward the skull of Balerion again in the distance, wondering if one day one of his grandchildren might take a dragon for a mount if he was blessed with a daughter who could wed a son of Jon's. I do not even remember what she looks like. Beautiful, Jon remarked. With beautiful brown eyes and beautiful brown hair and a smile that lit up the room. At least that's how you have described her to me, vividly, for the last year or so. Twat, he muttered. You know what I meant. I have been away from her longer than we spent together, yet she is my wife. I remember her hair and her eyes and her smile, but I don't remember anything else. Yes, you do. You remember that you love her, and you miss her, at least if your smile every time you read her letters is any indication. The rest of it will come with time. Lady Catelyn and father were separated for over a year after they wed, Jon said eventually, pushing himself away from the wall. Their love did not suffer from it. I am sure yours and Margaery's will be the same. 300 AC. Jon Snow. I am sorry, he said softly. On the bed, Viserys did not turn his gaze away from the ceiling. He's dead. Yes, Daenerys whispered. He died the day before yesterday. He was here, I think, Viserys said suddenly. He spoke to me. I remember it. He did, he agreed. He read to you with us. And he spent time with you alone. Viserys was silent for a moment. His uncle's eyes remained fixed on the ceiling, and Jon was unsurprised to see they looked faintly wet. He glanced away to give his uncle a moment of privacy and accidentally met Daenerys' gaze. Her eyes were wet, like her brother's, but he knew that it was not sadness he was seeing in her eyes but guilt. He left this for you, he said, handling over the scroll that was clenched tightly in his hand. Viserys' fingers gripped it out of reflex more than anything else, but nonetheless Jon was grateful his uncle had taken it. Who else? Viserys rasped. His eyes flicked to Daenerys, and she smiled softly at him and leaned forward to grasp Viserys' free hand. Ned Stark, Mage Mormont, Eddard Karstark and Great Jon Umber, she murmured. Sir Jaime. Robb lost his direwolf as well. Oh. There was a brief pause, and then Viserys' eyes finally moved away from the ceiling and toward Jon. I'm sorry. He choked out a noise halfway between a sob and a laugh, suddenly feeling emotional, and grasped Viserys' hand that was still holding the scroll tightly in his own. I am just glad that we need not count you among them. You did though, Viserys murmured. I was dead. Now I'm not. On the other side of the bed, Daenerys sucked in a deep breath and rose to her feet. He glanced up and watched as tears dripped out of the corners of her eyes. She muttered something too quiet for him to hear properly, but he saw Viserys flinch out of the corner of his eye. You and Daenerys have grown close. I can tell. He stiffened slightly, even though Viserys' words had come out more gently than he had ever heard his uncle speak before, and turned away from where he had been watching the door close out of the corner of his eye and back toward his uncle. "We have," he replied cautiously. Viserys nodded to himself and glanced toward the door and then back to Jon. His uncle shifted in the bed and pulled himself up more. On his lap, the fledgling dragon let out a little grumble of discontentment and raised its head to glare at Viserys before it dropped it again and curled up into a tighter ball. Its snout disappeared under its tail and, a few moments later, little snuffles could be heard. "I would be glad," Viserys said suddenly, his voice slightly high-pitched as though the words had tumbled out before he could stop them. His uncle paused and cleared his throat, and his eyes darted away from Jon and down to the dragon on his lap. "I would be glad if you wished to wed her, nephew. All I wish is for her to be happy and to be safe. She could not hope to find a better husband." "Thank you," he murmured. "Daenerys is special to me." "You should call her Dany," Viserys murmured, leaning back in his bed and closing his eyes as he suddenly looked inexplicably tired. "She likes it when those who love her call her Dany." He made to open his mouth, but a knock at the door interrupted him. "Enter." The door creaked open, and a shock of black hair and bright blue eyes appeared. "Your Grace, Prince Viserys." "Lady Shireen," he greeted. "I thought we had agreed I was Jon when we're alone." Shireen flushed brightly and slipped further into the room. Jon thought that the door might close behind her, but Ser Davos appeared and gave him a small smile before he closed the door and headed over to one of the chairs by the fireplace. There was a pause whilst the three of them watched Ser Davos get comfortable and settle into the chair until, eventually, brief snores sounded indicating the man had already fallen asleep. Not that Jon could blame him, the last week or so had been difficult on all of them. "Father mentioned that a small council meeting was due," Shireen said, the words tumbling out of her mouth. "I thought, Ser Davos, and I might keep Prince Viserys company." The book she held clutched to her chest slipped slightly, and she ducked her head in embarrassment. He glanced toward his uncle and raised an eyebrow. When Viserys met his gaze with a look of polite bafflement, Jon could not help but smile and glance towards Shireen. "Lady Shireen has been reading to you this last week." "They're the books that Maester Aemon bought from the wall," Shireen whispered. "He gifted them to me." She flushed a bright red. "I thought you may enjoy them." There was a strange noise from behind Jon, as though Viserys could not quite comprehend someone willingly spending time reading with him, and then Viserys choked out, "Which books?" "We started on Dragonkin. It details the growth rates of particular types of dragons, their preferences and their lineage," Shireen said, her voice rising slightly the more she spoke. "But we finished that last night. I thought today we might start on Blood and Fire." Out of the corner of his eye, Jon watched as Viserys lurched forward and then sunk back as though the sudden move had made him sick. "Blood and Fire." "Yes, my prince. The only known copy was said to be in the Citadel." Jon turned more fully toward Shireen in time to watch a bright red flush creep up her face. She jostled the book under one arm and brushed her hair back, tucking it behind one of her large ears. "Maester Aemon liberated it from the Citadel over 80 years ago. He told me all about it." He thought Shireen might not say anymore, and then the girl straightened her spine and fixed her bright blue eyes on them. "I could tell you about it, if you wish, my prince." Her eyes snapped back to the floor almost immediately. There was a long pause and then Viserys heaved out a breath. "I should like to hear that story, my lady." Shireen's flush deepened, but she wrenched her eyes away from the floor and up toward the bed. "Shireen. My name is Shireen." Viserys came the half-whispered reply. When Jon glanced back towards his uncle, he found that Viserys was watching Shireen with a peculiar expression on his face. It took a few moments for Jon to place it, and when he did, he could not help but smile widely because the look on his uncle's face was contentment. ****. You should not blame yourself, Dany," he murmured, trying not to wince at the way the name sounded so unnatural coming from him. Daenerys let out a huff that came out partly hysterical and partly tortured, as though it had become caught in her throat. She coughed and let out a small noise that sounded slightly like a sniffle. He glanced away from her and out over the bay, watching the sunrise and trying desperately to think of something to say that would make Daenerys feel better. The sun was barely a speck low on the horizon when he first started looking at it, and as the minutes slipped by and it rose higher and higher up into the air, He wondered whether he would ever know what he should say to his aunt. "He will never forgive me," she whispered. "He is your brother," he replied. Next to him, Daenerys let out another sniffle. Without looking at her, he pulled her against his side, wrapping them both in his cloak. "You are his sister. There is nothing you could do that Viserys could not forgive. Aemon is dead. He was going to die regardless of what happened," he breathed. Before he could lose his courage, he pressed a kiss against his aunt's hair when she burrowed her head into his shoulders and then breathed out a quiet sigh of relief when she did not pull away. "Aemon was old before we were even born. I know it does not make it easier to hear, but it is how he wanted to go." They were silent for a few moments. "When I first arrived at Castle Black, the joy in his eyes when he saw me was resplendent," he said softly. "It was all I saw because it was all I wanted to see. I did not realize that there was anything else there. I did not even realize it 6 moons later. I was so wrapped up in myself, in being Ned Stark's bastard shoved off to the wall and then being Rhaegar's bastard, and then, moons later, being Rhaegar's heir. No matter how many times I looked at him, I did not see the guilt in his eyes, but it was there just carefully hidden." He fell silent, unsure what to say next, but before he could lose his nerve, Daenerys' head turned and she glanced up at him, eyes sad. 5 and 10 years is a long time to live with regret," he murmured eventually, eyes still locked on hers. What he was able to do for Viserys gave him peace after years of torment. "Viserys will not see it like that," Daenerys whispered. "I cannot see it like that." There was a brief pause and then she glanced away, breaking eye contact, and stared out at the bay. "The only thing that can pay for life is death. I knew what the price was. I knew it the day I burned Drogo. But I tried anyway. And the gods have punished me and House Targaryen." He froze for a moment before he forced himself to relax. This was the first time she had ever spoken of what had happened with Drogo. "The gods have not punished you, Dany. If anything, they have done the opposite. Aemon chose to die, and they gave him the mercy of death in his sleep and still let it bring Viserys back." Daenerys was silent for so long that Jon was not sure she would speak again. Eventually, she heaved out a deep breath. "It is not fair. Life never is," he murmured. "But we keep going anyway." Daenerys did not reply and instead kept staring out at the sea. He sighed quietly to himself and cast around for another topic to discuss to try and distract Dany and, eventually, settled on the subject of Shireen and Viserys. "Viserys seemed quite taken with Lady Shireen," he said. Then he winced, realizing how the words sounded. "I did not mean it like that." Daenerys sorted out a laugh that came out slightly hysterical and high-pitched, and his heart clenched again. "My brother has been many things, but he has never lusted after a child." "I knew precisely what you meant," Daenerys replied. "I cannot say I am surprised. Viserys has long feared others' judgment of him. He expects swords in the back after what he did. Shireen is incapable of that. Her face gives too much away. He will have seen in her what we have seen, and he will take to her." "You think Aemon's hopes for a match may come to fruition?" She nodded and put her glass down on the table in front of them. "No time soon," he murmured. "He will not wish to tarnish her." She was silent for a moment and then sighed out, "And he will worry what people will say about their age difference. Ever since we arrived in Westeros he has worried about the views of others." "And you?" he asked. "Do you not worry about the views of others?" "I sometimes," she admitted, her voice soft. "I worry what they think about Rhaegar. I worry that they will consider him a bastard and judge him unworthy. I worry that he has no future here." "He will always have a future here, Dany," he refuted, leaning forwards and grasping her free hand so he could turn her slightly toward him. "As long as I sit on the throne, and House Stark rules the north, he shall always have somewhere to call home in Westeros. He paused and then, finally plucking up the courage, whispered, "Koi Koi." Daenerys' eyes widened and she laughed. He shrunk away slightly, feeling a flush creep over his face, and went to release her hands. "I am laughing at your pronunciation, not at you," she said, tightening her grip on his hands. Her eyes moved over his face for a moment, a frown between her brows, and she said, "You called me Dany." Out of the corner of his eye he could see Ghost's head shoot up and his direwolf stare at him, as though willing him not to lose his confidence. Through his bond with Winter, he could feel amusement trickle through and her thoughts that humans were slightly odd. He forced himself away from concentrating on them and instead turned his full focus to Dany, who was still watching him with a peculiar expression on her face. Viserys said I should call you Dany. He said you liked it when people who loved you called you Dany. ***. Lady Catelyn. Your Grace. He gestured to the chair on the other side of his desk and watched her as she settled into it, using her distraction as she arranged her skirts carefully to look over her. She looked tired, exhausted in truth, with deep marks under her eyes, and her hair was more lifeless than he had ever seen it. She had lost weight and her cheekbones, which had always been sharp and high, seemed unnaturally so in her face. She looked older as well, haggard almost, in a way that made him feel a twinge of sympathy in his chest. It was a horrible reminder that, for all they would never like each other given their shared history, they shared the same love for House Stark. When his eyes met his, he glanced away. I. They both stopped talking. You go first, Lady Catelyn. I heard that you are sending your armies north and that the dead are allegedly marching south. He nodded. And the wildlings are scaling the wall in numbers we have never seen before. When she made no move to speak further and instead gave him a long, questioning look, he pushed the scroll from Small John Umber toward her. He watched her carefully as her eyes tracked over the words, her face growing paler the more she read and her eyes tightening slightly at the edges as she contemplated the words. I will be going north, he said once he was sure she had finished reading. And Bran. He sucked in a deep breath. Hojan Reed had green dreams. Lady Catelyn was silent for a long time. Her fingers tightened and then relaxed around the scroll in her hands in a manner that Jon recognized. She was furious but trying to control herself with him in a manner she had never done before. The nature of his birth had been revealed. He is a child. I know, he agreed. Her eyes whipped away from the scroll and up to his, and her mouth parted slightly in surprise as though she had not expected his agreement. You love Bran, she said eventually, his voice pitched in a manner that Jon knew meant she was trying, desperately, not to scream or fly into a rage. You love Bran. He is my brother, he said quietly. I will take Winter beyond the wall, and I will either provide reinforcement until our soldiers can march beyond the wall to join us, or I will help bring him home, whatever his purpose north of the wall. If I had known what was there, I would never have sent him. And what of me? You can travel north with my armies, or you can stay here. Lord Baratheon, as Hand, will rule in my stead whilst I am gone. He paused and considered his next words carefully. If you wish to stay here, I will arrange for Rickon to come south. Not Sansa or Arya. His lips quirked into a smile despite his attempts to stop them. I am not sure I could convince Arya or Sansa to do anything they did not wish to. Ned, Lady Catelyn began. Then her voice ceased, and she sucked in a deep, choking breath. Ned told me of the boy, Gendry, and of Sansa's fondness for him. She was silent for a moment. He wished them to be wed. Her eyes flicked away from him toward the dragon that was sleeping on the balcony. Can you name him true? For Sansa. He leaned back in his chair. I would need to speak to Lord Baratheon. He is aware of Gendry's existence, we have discussed the matter. But if I name Gendry true, there may be questions about the legitimacy of Shireen's claim as his heir when he passes, and Lord Renly will not have children. I understand. She wishes to stay in the north, he continued. If it was the south, I may have a greater chance of finding her a keep. So many houses have been lost to us, but the north, there is so little there in the way of land. I can name him true, but without a keep. I will find them a keep, Lady Catelyn said, her voice slightly sharp. She flushed slightly and looked down at her hands. I will find them a keep. If needs be, my brother has yet to wed, and he may never do so. Or they can stay at Winterfell, Robb will not turn them away. He nodded. Then I shall ask Lord Baratheon. ***. The little dragon was a menace. It had finally extracted itself from Viserys' presence, likely due to the sheer boredom of being confined to one room, and had decided to make Jon's life a misery. He watched it as she belched out puffs of smoke and then flicked her tail and sent his inkpot tumbling to the floor where it shattered. He swore quietly to himself, and the little dragon stared up at him unrepentant. You are a menace. Go find Daenerys. The little dragon cocked her head to side as though she was considering his words carefully, and then she let out a little belch and jumped off his desk with her wings spread to carry her carefully down to the ground. She skittered across the floor, her youth and lack of coordination making her go more sideways than forwards, until she bumped against the door several times. The door swung inwards, and the little dragon let out an affronted noise, and then took off down the passageway. "Will you keep an eye on her?" Ghost nudged his leg and then took off, following the little dragon out the room with his tail held high. "They are smart." He turned towards his companion. Olenna Tyrell was a tricky woman, as he had expected and had been warned. What he had not expected was for her to be tiny. She did not even come up to his chest, and she was old and frail in a way that Eamon had never been, skinny, with thin fingers, and a jowly neck. Yet, she still terrified him slightly. Her tongue was sharp and her wit biting. For all he knew that it had served her well, and that she would not do him or those he loved harm, he was still uncomfortable in her presence. Dimly he wondered why many whispered of Prince Oberyn as being a viper, for if ever Jon had met a viper, it was Lady Olenna. "My granddaughter would have been queen in another life," Lady Olenna continued, ignoring the fact he had not replied to her previous comment. "But not this one, Lady Olenna," he replied. "In this life, she is the Lady of Winterfell and the wife of the Warden of the North." Lady Olenna squinted at him but did not reply. "And should anything happen to my brother, you must understand that I would not wed Lady Margaery. So, our support was for naught." He sighed and leaned back in his chair. "When I wed, my son, assuming I am blessed with one, will wed a daughter born from the match between Margaery and Robb. You will get your blood on the throne, one way or another." The cane in Lady Olenna's hands tapped the floor several times as she regarded him carefully. "And Laura's?" Renly Baratheon bent the knee, and his armies joined Lord Baratheon. "Your grandson bent the knee as well. That is all I think must be said on the matter." Lady Olenna leaned forward slightly, and her cane made a slight squeaking noise as it skidded across the floor. "I hear you wish for your armies to march north. Why?" "Because reports from the wall indicate that something strange is happening in the far north, and, if nothing else that they report is true, the wildlings are fleeing south. You need men to harvest the grain. This winter will be long. My small council and I have already come to a decision on this. A decision that House Tyrell, the wardens of the largest and most fertile region of Westeros, was not included in." "Second largest region," he corrected softly. He watched as Lady Olenna's eyes sparkled in delight, and she leaned back in her chair. "You have a spine. Good. I would have thought that was quite obvious. Well, you are being quite simpering. A king cannot give out boons such as promising his son's hand to his brother's daughter as freely as you have. Overpromising and failing to deliver is worse than promising anything. If I did not know better, Lady Olenna, I would think you were offering me guidance." She snorted and then cleared her throat. "My granddaughter chose to wed Robb Stark because she loves him," she said, the word love twisting in her mouth as though it was something rather unpleasant. "It seems, for better or for worse, you have tied our houses together. And I rather foresee there will be a lot of worse coming in the next few years. Regardless of whatever is happening beyond the wall, you need to decide what to do with the Iron Islands. Balon Greyjoy is dead, his brother is dead, Yara Greyjoy has taken the Seastone chair. She is yet to declare herself queen, and many of her men are dead, but they are still a threat. Mrysella Baratheon Lannister, forgive me, lives. There are many who believe she is still Robert's daughter. Your plan to wed her to Monterys Velaryon is a good one, but not a bright one. Then you have the Vale Lord Royce is going to struggle to get anything out of the Eyrie. So that will need to be dealt with. And, as you know, the Eyrie is impregnable. And let us not forget Dorne. Prince Oberyn might be your friend, but are his daughters? Is Prince Doran? No, I certainly would not be your friend in these circumstances. And Prince Doran's son may be in Highgarden, and due to wed my granddaughter, but we cannot hold him hostage forever. Essos has turned their gaze on you, your aunt and uncle, the unwed Targaryen king, the tragic Targaryen princess and the mad Targaryen prince. Offers will be made, eventually. You have enemies to your south, enemies to the north and enemies to the west. And, because my granddaughter is a simple-minded fool, we are going to be bound to help you. I rather thought you would be bound to help me because you are part of the Seven Kingdoms, Lady Olenna. So was House Hightower. Careful, Lady Olenna, your granddaughter may be bound by marriage to my brother, but my temper grows short. Good. Perhaps you will do something more than sit in that god-forsaken chair and play at being king. Please, by all means, continue to insult me. I am sure that will end well for the both of us. Let us get to the crux of the matter. I may not like you, your grace, and I may think you are naive and too young to make a competent ruler, but as I said, we are bound by marriage, and if House Targaryen should fall, then so will House Tyrell and House Stark. Just because the war is won, does not mean we are safe. So, you will offer me a place on your small council until my grandson returns from Winterfell and is able to take up the seat. You have smart men advising you. Lord Baratheon is not without his wits, and you have installed, perhaps, the one few good apples from the Westerlands, and you have Prince Oberyn. But loyalty is easily lost and easily bought. The only person who is undoubtedly loyal to you is Lord Baratheon, and that is mostly because his sense of duty and honor forbids him from the sorts of betrayal that others might consider. And you will be loyal, will you? Lady Olenna smiled sharply at him. For Margaery. For her happiness and her life. Always. He leaned back in his chair and regarded her carefully and, a few moments later, realized he had inadvertently settled into the same position that she had. Very well, he replied. Then he rose to his feet, crossed the room and opened the door. His eyes met one of the Tyrell soldiers who was currently part of the Kingsguard rotation, and he smiled. Send someone to fetch Lord Baratheon and Lord Varys, please. Then he shut the door sharply and headed back to his desk, pausing as he drew level with the table that a servant had put refreshments on. Wine, Lady Olenna. His companion nodded, and he poured her a generous measure of wine and passed the glass to her. He settled back behind his desk and went to take a long swig of the wine. I wouldn't, if I were you. He paused, glass halfway to his mouth, and lowered it again. He put the glass down on the desk and regarded her carefully. Why not? Perhaps we ought to wait for Lord Baratheon to arrive. They waited in silence for nearly half an hour before all the men he had asked for arrived. Finally, once Lord Stannis had sat down as far away from Lady Olenna as could be allowed in such a small area, Jon turned his attention back to the lady in question. Why did you say I should not drink the wine? Lady Olenna gave him a sharp, piercing look. Then she huffed rather indelicately and wrinkled her nose. Several days ago, your household took on new servants in the kitchen. You were quite right to remove those you thought loyal to House Lannister, and you did an excellent job of it. Unfortunately for you, you forgot that Petyr Baelish had many friends in this city. Whilst I am not sure that this is poison, something destined for the king will be, eventually. It is only a matter of time. Where are the food tasters? Where are the guards monitoring the kitchens? I slipped in and out of there earlier and there was no one monitoring what was happening, although I suppose slipped is a rather inaccurate description of my movements these days. I am, of course, not as agile as I once was. I did not hear whispers of this, Varys said. His voice was as flat as it always was, but there was a slight twitch to his cheeks that made Jon think that, perhaps, Varys was annoyed by the implicit suggestion he was incompetent. You would not, Lady Olenna remarked blithely. I, however, did. Because, no matter what Littlefinger could pay, I could pay more. Little birds can only get you so far, Lord Varys. We have seen no evidence of any attempts, nor of any treachery, Stannis said. You wouldn't. Poison is a woman's weapon. Enemies to the north, he murmured. Lysa Arryn. I imagine so. The servants may have been in Littlefinger's pocket, but he is dead and Lysa Arryn remains, Lady Olenna replied. There is not so furious as a woman scorned, your grace. You cannot prove this. We cannot just dismiss all the servants and find new ones, he said, cutting across Lady Olenna before she could retort to Lord Stannis' statement. And your suspicions are only suspicions, Lady Olenna. I agree, came the sharp reply. You cannot simply dismiss them. You must catch them in the act, and then you must use them to attain proof that it is Lysa Arryn who has given the orders, if indeed any have been given. What if your spies are correct and they are under instructions to poison me? I suggest you employ a taster and double the guards around the kitchen surreptitiously, of course. They won't try and kill you if they think they are being watched. Of course, he muttered. He sighed and ran a hand down his face. And it is just me. Yes, came the terse reply. They believe that, Without you, support for your aunt and uncle will collapse. No one wants the Mad King's son on the throne. And what of Daenerys? He watched as a small smile flickered across Varys' lips for a moment before it vanished. On his other side, Stannis gave Jon a look that he wasn't quite sure he could discern but seemed both bemused and unamused at the same time. Married off and her son killed. Lady Olenna leaned forward and peered at him with a slightly smug expression. Might I make a suggestion? I am sure you will regardless. You need an heir, your grace. An heir born from your seed. An heir who can consolidate your rule. We have discussed this, Lady Olenna. I believe Lady Tyrell speaks of your aunt, your grace, Stannis murmured. She is advising you to wed Princess Daenerys. There was a brief pause and then Stannis continued, in a voice that suggested he was perhaps being held at knife point to get the words out. It is not a suggestion without its merits. Interlude, 300 AC Aemon Targaryen. King's Landing was beautiful. He had never thought that before. It was not beautiful in the true sense of the word, not like many women were. And it was not beautiful in the rugged sense of the word, like a man might be. But it was beautiful because of what it represented. It was a place where he had experienced so much joy and so much grief and then joy again. A place that had cursed his family 1,000 times and seen them fall, only for them to rise again. There was a beauty to be found in that, tragic as it might be. He snuggled further down into the blankets that were tucked up under his chin. 102 years. He had regrets. So many that he could not count. Too many. Enough that he would need to live 1,000 lives to remedy them all. But, to regret was to be human. And, despite all his regrets, he could not help but feel he had always been precisely where he had needed to be, no matter how hard it was to believe it on occasion. The path that had brought him here had been fraught with strife, challenge and grief, but it had been his path. Behind him, Daenerys and Jon slept in their chairs. They had fallen asleep hours before when the conversation between the three of them had naturally come to a close and they were unable to keep themselves awake any longer. He knew that they felt it, as he did. They had not wanted to sleep and lose a minute more of their time with him. But even they could not stop nature, or time. In the distance, he could see Winter and the other 3 dragons circling above King's Landing. They were restless even without a true bond with any of them, he could feel it and had not settled all day. He knew why. In the corner of the room, in the huge fireplace, the dragon egg rocked backwards and forwards slightly as though the creature within longed to come towards him. It was still pushing against his thoughts with anger and grief in equal measure, but under that there was an air of acceptance and thanks for the gift he was giving. He moved slightly so he could turn his head up to ceiling and stared at the cracks in the paintwork above that were illuminated by the waxing moon. He hid a smile as, on his thigh, Ghost let out a little grumble and snuggled further in toward him, a reminder of all those moons at Castle Black when the direwolf had kept him warm. He was not cold now though. He was hot, almost as though he was on fire. It was the warmest he had ever been, even when he had been a child, and the hottest summer on record had made King's Landing feel like it was boiling. He had not felt like this. He had hated it then. He loved it now. He had heard so many men talk of how they had felt cold when their death was approaching and their fear of being alone. No. Not fear. Terror. He had feared death then, for to be cold and alone was a cruel fate for any men, let alone the blood of the dragon. But he was not alone, and he was not cold. The end.